Now, here's an important question that a lot of people have been asking and wanting an answer for. And the question is, can you get COVID-19 for a second time after a full recovery? Well, some experts are beginning to worry that this is a very real and strong possibility after Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro said on Wednesday that he tested positive for the new coronavirus for a second time following his July 7th announcement that he had COVID-19. Well, there are also reports surfacing globally confirming that a person has been diagnosed with COVID-19 infection for a second time. Last week, a physician from New Jersey in the United States claimed that 2 of his patients contracted the virus again, just 2 months after recovering from their initial infections. Similar stories have circulated around the country, prompting people to question whether they are truly safe from reinfection after an initial bout with the disease. Now experts are scrambling to understand just how long people are protected from infection after they've already recovered from COVID-19. Well, for some insights on this, we're now joined by Professor Adrian Puren, who's the head of department at the National Institute for Communicable Diseases, the NICD. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, Professor. Welcome to the program.
Good evening, Peter, and to your viewers. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
So this is a huge question that people are asking. A lot of people are going around thinking that once I've had it and recovered, my body builds immunity and I'm safe from it after that. What do we understand now about that position?
Well, I think we are starting to build up greater detail around the immune response, and I think that that's going to be really critical in understanding whether or not people will become reinfected. And I think there's been recent publications to show, in fact, that the immune response really also depends on the levels of exposure to the virus, or how much virus you have in circulation in your body. And the recent paper looked not only at 30 days, where most studies have ended, but in fact beyond that, up to about 90 days. And it does show that in individuals who are more severely infected, in fact, their antibody responses only started to wane at about 90 days, whereas individuals who had a more milder form of infection, in fact, their antibody responses declined much more sooner, let's say after 30 days or so. So it's thought that these responses are more like what we see what the coronaviruses cause, or the less harmful coronaviruses cause in the so-called common cold, for example. And it's likely, therefore, that you may have bouts of infection with regard to this particular virus specifically.
All right, so let me understand this then. So when you get the virus, your body goes through a process and your immune system starts to deal with the emergency at hand, and it uses its knowledge as best as it can to deal with that, and it remembers what it did so that if it does come back, it'll react much quicker. But what you're suggesting is that once you've recovered, this memory only lasts for a limited period of time. So you only have immunity for a limited period of time. Is that what you're saying, if I'm understanding what you're saying?
That's correct. So it's not quite like flu.
Yeah.
But along those particular lines. As you know, each year we need to be vaccinated for flu. And that's because of the changes in this particular in the virus, in the flu viruses. But it's likely in the case of coronaviruses that immunity actually wanes and you can be re-exposed and be reinfected.
All right, so is it as dangerous the second time as the first? Do we know?
I'm afraid for coronavirus, we don't actually know that. Only we know in the common cold, for example, the symptomatologies are generally more or less the same. But I think we're unclear with regard to the current coronavirus.
All right, so with that in mind then, what are we talking about with the vaccine?
Well, it's the same question, in other words. So you have to design a vaccine which we hope will provide you long-term protection. We do know that the more severe forms of coronaviruses, such as MERS or SARS-CoV-1, certainly it's given more durable protection, but it looks as if this particular virus may be behaving differently.
All right, so bottom line, even if you've recovered, we almost have to act as if we're starting again from scratch and just be safe.
Absolutely. I think we need to be clear that we don't understand all the aspects around immunity. For example, we also know that it's not just the antibody responses, but also the T cell responses. So in fact, even though your antibodies may have waned, you may still have T cell responses that could be protective.
We're hearing stories, and you know, we never know quite the full story, but at the beginning of all of this, there were suggestions that it's a certain age group and people with certain comorbidities that were vulnerable. But it does seem that people outside of these parameters seem to be also falling really sick with COVID-19. Is there some development in terms of understanding and knowledge regarding who is vulnerable?
I think there's a lot of studies ongoing to understand immune responses, for example, also genetic backgrounds. So again, they're looking at various genes in the immune system that may be linked to, for example, poor outcomes. So for example, you've heard of the cytokine storms. So is there some genetic background that actually contributes to those particular type of responses?
All right. So, you know, at the beginning of this conversation, I had quite a lot of hope, but it's slowly now almost getting to a point where we really just have to treat it as if you can get infected, and if it does come back, you've got to go through the same process over and over again. Maybe what we can start talking about is how we respond to COVID-19 once we get it. What are the things that we can do immediately?
Well, I think it's really taking note of what the symptoms are. So again, we have a range of responses to this particular virus, from very mild to more severe. So I think it just depends on what the symptoms are and are they manageable. And can you go into self-isolation and have symptomatic care, for example? But if it's more severe, where you have difficulty breathing, then I think that's where you have to seek for medical assistance.
All right, so where are we with this COVID-19 curve in South Africa now? You know, you hear things like Sweden going the herd mentality route. We tried to slow down the pandemic at the beginning, and I think we succeeded in that. Perhaps that plays out in the number of deaths being so much lower than other countries with a similar infection rate. So where are we? Where do you see us now in this COVID-19 curve?
So I think for us as a country, different parts of the country will be reaching what we call the peak of infections. That's the maximum number of infections. And then we'll have a plateau and maybe declines and a slower decline in the number of deaths. This will happen in different stages in the country. But remember, we are not aiming towards the herd immunity effect. I think we still have to ensure that the physical distancing, the wearing of gloves, the hand hygiene, cough etiquette, ensuring that we stagger our work hours or work at home, shielding those that are vulnerable. You mentioned all those comorbidities such as diabetes and hypertension. Those individuals need to be shielded and protected in order for us not to have the herd immunity effect happening rapidly.
So we're the 6th most infected country in the world now, with 337,594 positive cases. I don't want to spread panic, but what do we do? I mean, are we winning this thing, or is this just a scenario where we just have to do the best we can under the circumstances?
So I think it still comes back to what I call the personal responsibility around those very things that I've spoken. And so physical distancing, all those things need to be in place in order for us to really try and limit transmission as far as possible, given that our options are very limited. And I think we will have to wait and see and and hope that, for example, there be antiretroviral therapies coming in, or, for example, that the vaccine comes along, which may well assist us, because we're very far off from herd immunity in South Africa.
We talk about getting to a peak. How do we know when we've got to this peak? What happens?
But when you get to the peak, you'll start seeing a flattening. And that's, remember, what we spoke about from the very beginning of this outbreak, called it the flattening of the curve. And that was to provide us with an opportunity to enhance our capacity in order to ensure that those individuals with the greater ages, the comorbidities, do not end up in our high care centers and ICU. And so that's what you'll see, is that we have actually limited transmission, not to the extent that we would like to have. So we will see that very sharp rise that we're seeing in Gauteng, and then slowly reaching a plateau.
All right, and this measure really is only going to be those that have gone to hospital. So we start to see less and less people going to hospital, because the reality is many people are going to get sick at home. They won't even bother testing. They'll ride it out, and they'll never be recorded.
Yes, I think that's one outcome, but I think what is going to happen in South Africa, we hope in the next few months, is that there will be actually serological surveys, and we will then see what the extent of exposure has been to viruses, just to cover the people, as you said, who will have mild disease, not being tested, but when we do these serological tests, we'll reveal whether or not they've actually been exposed.
Will we get to a point where we'll ever know just how many people had got COVID-19 and recovered? Perhaps they were completely asymptomatic, but just so that we can plan in the future for similar epidemics, will we ever get to do, I don't know what they call them, antibody tests, where we get a good census of what happened?
Absolutely. So you raise a very important point that I haven't touched on. For this particular virus, we know that it's not just symptomatic people that transmit the virus, but really a fair proportion, a large proportion of people who become infected are asymptomatic and actually transmit disease. So the way in which we will know this is by the serological test. These can either be lab-based tests or rapid tests that will really allow us to test those individuals, see whether they have the antibodies, and that will give us an estimate at the end of how many people in South Africa were infected, for example. So there have been lots of studies in other countries. So for example, Spain, the United States, and the UK are currently doing these particular types of testing. And South Africa is going to embark on that as well.
Professor Puren, thank you so much indeed for joining us this evening and sharing your thoughts with us. And yeah, I think the word really is we must just continue to be careful and do not relax on your laurels once you've had COVID and recovered. We just don't know enough as yet for us to be going out there as if we're totally immune.
Absolutely. Keep in your safe bubble.
All right. Thank you so much indeed. Take care.
Thank you.
All right. That was Professor Puren talking to us about COVID-19. And so the answer really to that question is, can you get reinfected? It appears that you can, and that the immunity that you build up tends to wane, and the length of time that you're immune is not quite clear, but it's different for different people according to the severity of your first case. So I guess until a vaccine and something more permanent comes up, please be careful and treat this very seriously and do all the things that you've been guided to do.